Welcome, Alison. I'm thrilled you're here, and thank you so much for joining us and for joining us for, although we're pre-recording before this day, for Spirit Rock Community, where we're focusing on a climate day. Of course, every day is a climate day, but also really looking more deeply into the systemic issues or systemic shaping of what's led us to this great catastrophe that we're in the middle of, and the heart of that being the colonial, extractive, dominant mindset, of course, which particularly decimated First Nations peoples around the world and has been in extremely brutal ways, not just the actual genocide, but cultural genocide. Through massive acts of violence. So this history now, which has been so marginalized and airbrushed out of school curriculums and common knowledge, is coming back much more into focus in our collective awareness. And there's much, the whole focus on decolonization has become a university curriculum, really. It's almost like any university worth its salt has to have that really central and focused. And and I know, of course, you being a member of the First Nation peoples and have been an advocate and on the front lines in so many ways. I've known you through, of course, we were on that climate train together 7 years ago, across the US to New York for the big climate march. And then I've, the Idle No More that you were co-originating and supporting as a local Bay Area indigenous-led activist movement. And then more, look also the Sogorea Te Land Trust. And so I'd like to just start there. This is Sogorea Te. It's a lonely land in Oakland.
Yeah, Oakland and Richmond and the whole Bay Area.
So, what it was particularly strikes me is this is a project centered around rematriation. So the focus on women, indigenous women reclaiming and taking land back. So I'd just be interested to hear anything about this work.
Very well, I'd be delighted. In some ways, I'm speaking sort of on behalf of the Confederated Villages of Lisjan and Karina Gould, who gave me permission to speak about the Sogorea Te Land Trust, since I am of Mohawk ancestry and live unoccupied. I'm not living in my own territory, and I am living on the Ohlone territory. So I just wanted to say that to start. So Sogorea Te Land Trust is a very inspiring and wonderful creation of the Ohlone people and some other tribal people and allies, and a lot of the other Native folks who live in the Bay Area are all very much in support of and working with them. So I think the Confederated Villages of Lisjan, the Chochenyo Cartina Ohlone people, back in the 70s, really started organizing to try to deal with all of the shopping centers and developments that were being placed on top of the ancient village sites and the and shell mound areas. So that was kind of the beginning. And then in 2012, I think it was, they set up the land trust. And this was partly after a long occupation of over 180 days at Glen Cove Park out in the Benicia area, which was a development being set up on traditional Ohlone ancient village site. And part of what happened there is because, and this happens often, the Ohlone people are not a state or federally recognized tribe. And so at the end of the occupation, the land was put into the hands of another tribe up north of here who had really no connection to the land. And most of our traditions are matriarchal, and women were really very much in charge of the tribes. And part of the thing that happened with colonization was that the United States and Canada set up alternative government structures that were mostly led by men. And so what had been a successful occupation ended up with the men in that tribe essentially returning most of the land to the developers. And so I think at that point, it became really clear that having a Indigenous women-led land trust in this urban area was really, really important. And so they've been organizing and doing incredible work, from doing work with children in the schools about how to be a good guest on when you're living in occupied lands, teaching people, doing work around the protection of the shell mounds. And then in 2016, a wonderful group called Planting Justice rematriated the first parcel of land, which is an acre of land up in East Oakland. So that was the beginning of a settler group actually doing what the land trust was set up for, which is putting the land back in Indigenous hands.
I would like in a minute to talk about how we can support. I think I would also like to just say something about this wonderful book that's just come out, The Red Deal. I don't know if you can see that, the lettering's back to front on my screen. The Red Deal, Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth, which I will be on the list for participants, and everyone must rush and get a copy. It's so profound. And I think what's so profound about it is that it really goes into the way that our current catastrophe of the breakdown of our living systems and mass extinctions that are happening are really deeply rooted in the colonial project and the systems that have been created around that, around this very extractive mindset, which centralizes human beings as the dominating force over all of nature. So it's a real fundamental shift away from that is embodied through Indigenous ways and understanding. So there's a lot more that's said about this and connecting it with our current crisis in this book. But to me, it seems so central that there has to be a very clear acknowledgement of past injustices, that the recognition of that, and along with that being backed up by reparations, primarily of land, obviously. While also at the same time, I think there's an increasing understanding and call for Indigenous leadership, and perhaps matriarchal Indigenous leadership at this time.
And I think in some ways, one of the first things that has to happen for people is really recognizing that we grew up in this country, in Canada, I'm sure in many other countries too, but we were all lied to about the history. We were all indoctrinated into kind of a story about founding fathers and democracy and truth and justice and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and kind of a whole story that was really a horrific lie. And I think for people, just the whole process of hearing about what really happened in terms of everything from, the blankets with the smallpox and the early germ warfare that was done, and then all of the different legal maneuvers from the doctrine of discovery to the Marshall stuff, that, it was like one kind of wave after another of different policies of genocide. And, that included both sort of actual genocide of killing off lots and lots and lots of people, but also the cultural genocide, the taking away of the languages, the so-called schools that you were talking about. So some of it is just facing and dealing with people, with all of our feelings about what does it mean to take a look at what really happened, and then to begin to reflect on, so as human beings who have the privilege of living at this incredibly challenging and exciting time in history, what's our responsibility in facing that, and also, what kind of reparations need to be made. And It's interesting because we're having this conversation today on what's Orange Shirt Day in Canada, which is there's just lots and lots of actions going on all across Canada today, in particular around the so-called residential schools. And I think that the interesting process there, where something that Indigenous people have known about for years is finally sort of public and proven. And then there's denial in some sectors, and I think this horrendous awakening for other people. So I think reparations does need to involve, funds for healing, really taking a look at what these policies of genocide on both sides of the medicine line, as we call the border, what these policies have done in terms of poverty and lack of infrastructure. And there's really reparations need to involve getting extractive industries out of Indigenous lands, letting us return to our more traditional forms of government instead of having to do these governments that were set up by the or ways of governing that are not our traditional ways of governing. So there's many, I think, layers of what reparations looks like. But I think the land back movement right now is really one of the most important and key.
Yes, and this is leads me to the last thing to I mean, there's so many things to discuss and
Right.
inquire into, but it really is translating this awareness and this understanding at this time when so much, the word apocalypse sort of the unveiling of so much that has been hidden, as you started off saying, and really having a much more realistic reckoning with our colonial history, and translating that into very practical actions. And so the last thing I would really like to talk about is that's something that we can all engage with, which is the Shumi tax, which is a direct recognition that we're actually offering compensation financially for actually all of us being here on Indigenous land. But everyone can do this, right? Everyone can explore what is their local, the unceded territories that they're in, and make a relationship and look how they can actually offer compensation.
Yeah, the Shumi land tax, I think, is just a very creative and wonderful thing that I think actually came out of dialogue between some of the settler allies and the Ohlone tribe here. And I would really encourage people to take a look at the Sogorea Te Land Trust website, just because it's so inspiring to get a sense of their vision and what they're doing. And on the page, you can actually kind of go in and you take a look at whether you're a renter or an owner and how many rooms do you have and kind of the size of the land that you're occupying. And then they do have suggested amounts that people can pay. And so essentially you're acknowledging that you're benefiting from and living on Ohlone lands and offering financial support to the land trust so that they can do the work that they're doing, which is sometimes it's about legal battles, sometimes it's about actually buying land back, the incredible work they're doing around bringing back their language and their culture. So it's a very wonderful land trust. And there are, since Karina and Janella set it up, down in Santa Cruz, the Alma Mutsun band has just set up a land trust. I know there's one in process with the Coast Miwok folks that they're trying to do in a similar way. Anyway, there's lots of different land trusts that are slowly being set up, but people can also donate to, there's like Acorn Wiki, which is a group that supports lots and lots of different tribes around bringing back language. Yeah, really almost anywhere you are, you can go to some of the websites that show you first whose land you're living on, and then you can begin to figure out what are some of the organizations that are active there. but there really are very many of them across the country that are doing this kind of work of giving people ways to, it both facilitates actual people actually, whether it's giving land back now or leaving that in their wills, and it also allows people to provide financial support. So it's, you know, and I have to say for myself as a Mohawk woman living on Ohlone lands, you know, it feels so good. It's a joyous thing when we when we write that check that that all of us, whether we're Native or non-Native, who are not living on our ancestral territories, it makes sense for us to offer support to the original peoples of the land.
And I know Kitisara and I are paying Shumi tax to the Sogorea Te Trust, which is the one that was most visible. And with the homework to look further afield into where we actually are was also ethically very important. Yes, thanks so much. I'm very mindful of your time, and we've sort of obviously extended as I thought we would, which is wonderful. Thank you so much. It's there's a lot there for people to contemplate. I'll have to. Well, I hope you have a good day ahead. And,
yes, you too, and delightful to be with you again, Tanisha.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'll join you down the road for something or other, I'm sure.
We say in Mohawk, Onigi Wahe, until we're together again.
Oniki Wahe.
Wahe.